Most of you want to make the most out of the work that you put in the gym. You want to get the most bang for your buck, to feel your muscles working, and to be confident that the exercises that you are performing in the gym are the best option for the muscle group that you're working. But then we have the question, how do you know that for sure? My name is Annie Miller, and I help you learn as you train and enjoy your lifts again. Today we do that by teaching you how to choose the best exercises for a given muscle group and what to focus on when performing said exercises. You can go to T-Nation or bodybuilding.com or some other site and search exercises for triceps and blindly go through the motions. But why are those the best exercises? What is the logic? How can you apply that logic to any muscle in the body? Do you go from machine to machine, just looking at the highlighted area on the little muscle diagram and go off of that? Sure, that's an option. Or you can use these 3 key considerations to choose the best exercise for any muscle group in the body. Let's do it. This one is for my trainers and my trainees. You do not need a degree to apply any of these concepts to your training. If you can Google a muscle, you can do this. It will be easier if you do have some background in anatomy and physiology, but it is not necessary. Okay. Education gains time. I am super stoked for this video. We are going to start by looking at the origin versus the insertion of a muscle. Now, I do not expect you to memorize names or exact locations of muscle attachments, but in strength and hypertrophy training, it's beneficial, especially for exercise selection, to at least have a general idea of what muscles cross certain joints, the general vicinity of a muscle attachment. My personal belief is that number 1, you're capable of learning that. And number 2, that in learning this, you may increase efficacy and joy in your training, which is exactly what I sell. Now, Anatomy 101, whether you're a trainee or a trainer, skeletal muscle pulls on bones via tendons in order to cause motion. That's what happens when a muscle is contracting. But every one of those muscles also has what's called an origin and an insertion, where the tendons of said muscle attach to the bone. All you need to know is that insertion points pull towards and contract towards origins. Let's look at the bicep, for example. Oh, shit. So the biceps cross the shoulder and originate at the scapula, and then they run down your upper arm, which is the humerus, and they insert and attach down at the top of your radius or your lower arm bone. Therefore, the muscle crosses 2 joints, the elbow and then up at the shoulder. When you do a bicep curl, you have a concentric contraction where the muscle shortens. You can see the insertion point moving towards the origin point. Then during the eccentric phase, when the muscle lengthens, the insertion point moves away from the origin. The same concept applies to pretty much any muscle in the body, certainly those commonly worked through your strength and hypertrophy training. Hamstrings, glutes, quads, core muscles, upper and mid back muscles, deltoids, biceps, triceps, calves, etc. Now we know origin and insertion. That's how the muscle functions when contracting, but let's look at movements. Before moving on to number 2, think about whether a movement is anchored at the origin or the insertion point. Is the muscle under most tension in the shortened or the lengthened position? Oftentimes people just pull exercises from a given muscle group out of a bag like Mary fucking Poppins. Not you. Not after today's video. They might even be choosing a decent or effective movement, but I want you to know why an exercise makes sense for a movement or for pairing a given exercise with another exercise. One of the factors we can look at, particularly when designing supersets or exercise pairings for a given muscle group, is where the muscle is under the highest tension. Is it at the peak concentric or shortened phase of the movement, or is it at the peak eccentric and lengthened portion of the movement? The benefit in looking at this when choosing exercise pairings is that you can choose an exercise that is at the highest tension in the lengthened phase to pair with an exercise that is at the highest tension in the shortened phase, and then we are working that muscle along its full range. We love this for hypertrophy potential and also just overall function of a muscle. Take the hamstrings, for instance. Who doesn't want some juicy hamstrings just hanging at the bottom of a squat? We all want that, and if you don't, you're probably just lying to yourself. The hamstrings tie in underneath the glutes at the ischium, which is like the inner but posterior curve of your pelvic bones. So think inner, lower, and back part of your pelvis. This is their origin. They run down the back of the leg and attach on either side, the inner or the outer, the medially or laterally, to the lower leg bones, your tibia and your fibula. Thus, the hamstrings cross both the knee joint and the hip joint. Therefore, they can be anchored at either of these spots when performing an exercise. Let's go ahead and look at the hamstring curl. The hamstring curl is very much so like the bicep curl. The hamstrings contract, pulling the calves towards the hamstrings and the insertion point towards the origin. The highest tension point for the hamstrings during this exercise is at the peak concentric or shortened phase. We can see that when we look at a hamstring curl. And you can think about that as when the hamstring is flexed or contracted. The primary movement here is knee flexion with little to no change in the hip. This is not the case for every movement that works the hamstrings. The Romanian deadlift is quite contrary to this. Where the curl has a stationary hip position, it can be zero hip flexion or slight hip flexion, but it's locked in, it's fixed. The RDL is literally a hip flexion exercise. Knee flexion is slight in an RDL and constant with little to no change. All the hamstring tension created in this exercise is coming from the hips flexing and then extending. Think about the hamstrings pulling the hips back into extension, so being anchored at the knees instead of at the hip like in the hamstring curl. The highest tension on the hamstrings in this exercise is going to be at the bottom of the movement when they're stretched at the peak of that eccentric phase. That's when they're lengthened the most and they have the most tension on them. You can see how this could be considered an opposite stimulus to the hamstring curl, and these would make a lot of sense to pair with one another. Not every exercise fits so cleanly into one of these boxes, but I hope it's fun to look at exercises through the lens of shortened versus lengthened and to determine where the muscle is experiencing the most tension when you're choosing your exercises. This is going to be especially important if muscle growth is a goal of yours. When you stress a muscle from different directions, angles, and ranges, you have potential to recruit different muscle fibers within that muscle. The Nordic hamstring curl is kind of a balance of the RDL and the hamstring curl. This is one of my all-time favorite hamstring exercises. We have knee flexion, but the hips are locked in, like the hamstring curl, but different. Though the hips are fixed and the knees bend and extend in the Nordic curl, the knee flexion is actually limited, starting at 90 degrees, and the glutes move away from and then back towards the calves. The tension is greatest as the muscle is elongating like the RDL, but little to no knee flexion and all the hip flexion. So somewhat similar to the position of the curl, but the peak tension happens at a different part in the muscle action. That was only one muscle group that we looked at, but I hope you can apply that to other areas of the body like the shoulders, the glutes, the triceps, quads, so on and so forth. Let's take a quick look at the glutes, how a deep single leg step up, a pull-up machine step down, or a Smith machine curtsy reverse lunge would have the most tension at the greatest degree of knee and hip flexion of the movement versus the hip and knee extension portion of the movement. Meaning where the glute is lengthened the most is where we have that tension. That's in comparison to something like the hip thrust, where the max tension is at the shortened top position, the concentric phase of the movement. I suppose it may be hard to know where the muscle is lengthened the most if you don't know the direction that that muscle fibers are running, which brings us to number 3. Directions of fibers. Which brings us to number 3. Directions of fibers. When you work the glutes, first off, that's 3 different muscles. You have the glute medius, glute minimus, and glute maximus, which you can't even see on this piece of shit. My point is that each of your glute muscles has different fibers within it, and we can stress those fibers through different movements. One exercise might stress or bias the upper fibers of the glute max versus the mid or lower fibers. It's far less complex than one might think. Do a goog of any muscle in the body, look at the fibers, you can see the direction, and then know that the muscle contracts in the direction of its fibers. We want to move or contract the muscle in line with these fibers as much as we can. Please do not lose sleep over this, but it is something to consider. This might not be making or breaking your muscle fiber recruitment or your gains, but it's fun to think about and to keep in mind for mind-muscle connection. Use origin, insertion, muscle tension, and direction of fibers to choose and pair exercises to ensure that you're stressing a certain muscle at its maximum ranges. This is the approach that you see in bodybuilding. You might know that they tend to demolish a muscle group from as many different angles and ranges as possible. But this is the why and the how, which I think is pretty cool. For this way to select exercises, let's look at the lats. Let me see his lats. Oh, his lats suck. The lats are the largest muscle in your back. It stretches from the upper arm across the bottom edge of the scapula all the way down to the posterior upper curve of your hip and lumbar spine to your low back. A muscle this large has many fibers running in slightly different directions, which means that you have options for movements to stress this muscle. The great news is that you can mostly split this muscle into upper and lower fibers. At the top, the fibers run more across the back horizontally. As you get lower down in the muscle, the fibers run more vertically down the back. With that knowledge, we can then consider origin and insertion that we talked about earlier. It originates along the spine and the hip and inserts distally at the upper arm. So think arm being pulled towards the spine and down towards the hips along those fibers. Are we connecting the dots? Can you see how the lat actually contracts and functions when we look at these different parts of the muscle? If you can, then you can infer that we'd want horizontal pulling, like rowing variations, for the upper fibers, and vertical pulling, like a lat pull down, to bias those mid and lower fibers of the muscle. To get even more specific, you can look at the degree of fiber direction in order to play with your elbow angle in different pulling exercises. Your elbow angle will change the direction of the pull and the stress on those fibers, so it's something to consider. It's easy to get caught in the weeds with this stuff, so please don't. Just remember that the basics work. Pushing a muscle from different ranges and motions and angles works to recruit the most muscle fibers. If you can take even one nugget from this video and understand the why just a bit more, then that is great. That is my only hope. The more often that you lift, look at muscles, and focus on using them, this stuff will make more and more sense to you, whether you're a trainee or a trainer. Look at where the muscles attach, the direction of the fibers, and then pay attention to where the muscle experiences the most tension within a given exercise. Make your choices or pairings accordingly. Have fun out there, happy gains, tell a friend, and I will see you guys in the next one.